What if the noise you're running from is the only thing keeping you from hearing yourself? We live in a world that screams louder every day. Notifications, expectations, the relentless demand to be more, do more, prove more. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, you forgot how to breathe without urgency. You built a life that looks successful from the outside, but feels hollow from the inside. And the worst part? You're not even sure when it started feeling this way. Here's the truth. No one wants to say out loud, strength isn't what you think it is. It's not about how much you can carry. It's not about how long you can last. It's not about never breaking. Real strength is knowing when to stop pretending everything's fine. It's the courage to face the silence you've been avoiding. It's the willingness to collapse so you can finally rebuild on solid ground. This isn't another video telling you to optimize your morning routine or hustle harder. This is about what happens when the hustle stops working, when the mask cracks, when the version of yourself you've been performing can't hold up anymore, and you realize that might be the best thing that ever happened to you. Eastern philosophy teaches something the modern world forgot. Suffering isn't the enemy, it's the doorway. And on the other side of that doorway, not weakness, not failure, but clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you stop running and finally turn around to face what's been chasing you all along. This video is about finding peace when everything screams, about discovering the strength no one sees, about learning to walk through chaos without becoming it. If you've ever felt like you're drowning in a life that's supposed to be working, this one's for you. Daniel didn't notice it at first, the way his body had started keeping score. His jaw clenched during Zoom calls. His shoulders carried tension like architecture he couldn't design away. The exhaustion wasn't just tiredness anymore. It was something older, deeper, like a river that had been dammed for too long. Eastern philosophy calls this the first whisper of samsara, the cycle of suffering we mistake for living. The emotional pain wasn't punishment. It was invitation. But he kept turning up the volume on everything else, hoping the noise would drown out what his soul was trying to say. He'd wake up at 6 a.m., check his phone before his pulse settled, and dive straight into productivity like it was a life raft. Emails, deadlines, coffee, repeat. The mind-body connection had been severed so cleanly, he didn't even feel the cut anymore. Buddhism teaches that suffering begins the moment we refuse to see what is, and Daniel had become an expert at looking away. He filled every silence with podcasts, every pause with planning, every moment of potential stillness with the urgency of something, anything else. The psychology of pain suggests that we avoid feeling not because we're weak, but because we're wired to survive. And survival, for so long, had meant staying busy. But pain doesn't ask for permission. It arrives like wind through an open window, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. One evening, Daniel sat in his car after work, engine off, hands still on the wheel. He wasn't going anywhere. He just couldn't bring himself to go inside yet. That's when it hit him. The exhaustion wasn't from doing too much. It was from being too much of what everyone else needed and too little of what he actually was. Taoism speaks of Wu Wei, effortless flow, the art of moving with life rather than against it. But Daniel had been fighting the current for years, and his body was finally refusing to keep swimming upstream. He thought about calling a friend, posting something online, anything to feel less alone. But the truth was, he didn't feel alone. He felt absent, like he'd been living his life from the outside, watching himself perform a role he never auditioned for. Self-awareness crept in like dawn, not all at once, but undeniable. The suffering wasn't about his job, his schedule, or even the noise. It was about the distance between who he pretended to be and who he'd forgotten he was. Zen philosophy teaches that enlightenment begins when we stop pretending. Daniel wasn't there yet, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed world. The call to awakening doesn't come with trumpets or clarity. It comes as a question you can't stop asking. Why does everything feel so heavy? Daniel stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. His life looked successful from every angle, the kind of life people scrolled past and envied. But success, he was learning, could be the loudest noise of all. Shadow work begins here, in this uncomfortable space between what we've built and what we've buried. He didn't have answers yet. He wasn't even sure he had the right questions. But something inside him had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. And that was the first crack in the mirror. Daniel spent the next few days trying to convince himself that moment in the car was just stress, just a bad week, just something a good night's sleep would fix. The ego has this brilliant way of turning vulnerability into a problem that needs solving, as if awareness itself were the enemy. He downloaded a meditation app, bought a book on mindfulness, and told himself he'd start fresh on Monday. Buddhism warns against this trap, the illusion that we can think our way out of what we need to feel our way through. But Daniel's mind was already 3 steps ahead, building a new plan, a better system, a shinier version of control. The impulse to appear strong was louder than the whisper asking him to be honest. He showed up to work the next morning like nothing had changed, smiled at his colleagues, cracked jokes in the break room, delivered his presentation with the kind of confidence that comes from years of practice. Eastern philosophy calls this the mask we wear when the temple inside is crumbling. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and they were wearing their own masks too. Either way, Daniel kept moving. The psychology of pain teaches us that resistance isn't about strength. It's about fear. Fear that if we stop pretending, we'll have to face what we've been running from. And Daniel had been running for so long, he'd forgotten what he was chasing. At home, he tried the meditation app, sat cross-legged on his living room floor, closed his eyes, and lasted maybe 2 minutes before his mind started screaming at him. "This is stupid. You're wasting time. You have emails to answer." He opened his eyes, checked his phone, and felt a strange mix of relief and shame. Zen philosophy speaks of the restless mind as a wild horse, untamed, unpredictable, afraid of stillness. Daniel's horse had been running for years and now it didn't know how to stop. So he stood up, made another coffee, and got back to work. Control felt safer than surrender, even if control was just another word for exhaustion wearing a suit. But here's the thing about ego dissolution. It doesn't wait for permission. It starts the moment you notice the cracks. Daniel's superpower had always been his ability to push through. Deadlines? He'd pull an all-nighter. Problems? He'd solve them. Chaos? He'd organize it. That's what made him good at his job. That's what made him feel valuable. But lately, pushing through felt less like strength and more like drowning with style. Taoism teaches that true power isn't about force, it's about flow. But Daniel's entire identity had been built on the force. He didn't know who he'd be without it. And that terrified him more than the exhaustion ever could. One night, his sister called. She was going through her own stuff. A breakup, a career shift, the kind of life upheaval that makes you question everything. Daniel listened, offered advice, told her she'd figure it out. And then she asked him something no one had asked in a long time. "But how are you really?" He opened his mouth to say fine, the word that had become his default setting. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the crack in the mirror getting wider. Maybe it was the way her voice sounded so genuinely curious, like she actually wanted to know. He paused, and in that pause, the resistance trembled just enough to let a sliver of truth slip through. "Honestly, I don't know." It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd stopped trying to fix the question before answering it. The breaking point didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of a client presentation Daniel had prepared for weeks. He was mid-sentence, explaining structural integrity and design flow, when suddenly the words just stopped. Not because he forgot them, but because for the first time in his career, he couldn't remember why any of it mattered. His mind went blank, not empty, but fractured, like a mirror that finally couldn't hold its own reflection anymore. The collapse isn't weakness emerging. It's the moment when the mind can no longer sustain the character it's been performing. Eastern philosophy calls this the necessary breaking, the death that precedes spiritual transformation. He excused himself, walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at his face in the mirror. His hands were shaking. His breath was shallow. The mind-body connection he'd ignored for so long was suddenly impossible to dismiss. This wasn't stress. This wasn't burnout. This was something older, rawer, the kind of reckoning that happens when the soul finally refuses to be silenced. Buddhism speaks of impermanence, the truth that nothing lasts. Not success, not control, not the version of ourselves we've spent years perfecting. Daniel had built his entire identity on being the guy who never broke. And now, standing in that sterile office bathroom, he realized the truth. He'd been breaking for years. He just hadn't let anyone see it. He called in sick the next day, then the day after that. His boss texted, concerned, not angry. Take the time you need. But time wasn't the issue. Daniel could have taken a month off and still come back to the same hollow feeling. The void wasn't in his schedule. It was in the space between who he'd become and who he actually was. Taoism teaches that emptiness isn't the enemy. It's the first step toward freedom. But Daniel wasn't ready to see it that way yet. To him, the emptiness felt like failure. Like everything he'd worked for was dissolving, and he had no idea what would be left when the dust settled. He spent those days in his apartment, doing nothing. Not meditating, not reading self-help books, not trying to fix himself, just existing. And it was terrifying. Without the noise, without the hustle, without the mask, who was he? The question sat in his chest like a stone. Shadow work begins here, in the silence that hurts. When the distractions fall away and you're left face to face with the parts of yourself you've been hiding. Daniel thought about his father, who'd worked himself into an early grave. He thought about all the times he'd been told that real men don't break down, don't ask for help, don't admit when they're drowning. And he realized he'd been living by rules he never agreed to. On the fifth day, something shifted. Not clarity, not yet, but a kind of softness he hadn't felt in years. He was sitting on his couch, staring at nothing, when he noticed his breath. In, out, simple, unforced. Zen philosophy speaks of the breath as the bridge between the body and the soul. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel wasn't trying to control it, optimize it, or make it productive. He was just breathing. And in that moment, the collapse stopped feeling like an ending. It started feeling like the first honest thing he'd done in years. The mask had finally shattered, and beneath it, not weakness, just a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to be human. When silence stops bringing peace and starts revealing what you've been avoiding, that's when the real work begins. Daniel thought the collapse would be the hardest part, but it wasn't. The hardest part was what came after. The days when he woke up with nowhere to go, no one to impress, no role to perform. Just him and the quiet. And in that quiet, voices he'd been ignoring for years started speaking. Shame, resentment, grief. The parts of himself he'd locked away because they didn't fit the narrative of the man who had it all together. Shadow work isn't about finding your darkness. It's about finally admitting it's been there all along, waiting to be seen without judgment. He started noticing patterns. How he'd say yes when he meant no. how he'd smile through frustration because anger wasn't professional, how he'd buried his feelings so deep that even he couldn't find them anymore. Eastern philosophy teaches that the shadow isn't the enemy. It's the disowned self, the unexpressed truth, the parts we exile because we fear they'll make us unlovable. Daniel had spent his whole life being the dependable one, the strong one, the one who never needed help. But underneath that armor, a man who was terrified of being abandoned if he ever stopped being useful. A man who measured his worth by how much he could carry, even when it was crushing him. One afternoon he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. Pictures from college, from his 20s, from a time when he still laughed without forcing it. There was one photo in particular, him at a music festival, arms around friends, eyes bright with something that looked like freedom. He stared at that version of himself and wondered, when did I stop recognizing who I was? The psychology of pain suggests that we don't lose ourselves overnight. We lose ourselves in small surrenders. Every time we choose safety over truth. Every time we silence our needs to keep the peace. Every time we perform instead of exist. Daniel had been performing for so long, he'd forgotten there was anyone left beneath the act. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was confrontational. It forced him to sit with the anger he'd never expressed, the grief he'd never processed, the fear he'd never admitted. Buddhism speaks of nirvana not as the absence of suffering, but as the willingness to face it without running. Daniel wasn't meditating or journaling or doing any of the healing things he thought he was supposed to do. He was just sitting with the discomfort, letting it move through him like a river that had finally been allowed to flow. Some days he cried for no reason. Other days he felt nothing at all, and both were okay. The shadow doesn't demand perfection. It just demands honesty. His sister called again. This time, when she asked how he was, he didn't deflect. He told her the truth, that he'd been pretending for years, that he didn't know who he was anymore, that the silence was terrifying but also the only thing that felt real. She didn't try to fix him. She just listened. And in that listening, Daniel realized something profound. The shadow isn't healed by being understood. It's healed by being witnessed. Zen philosophy teaches that suffering ends when we stop fighting what is. Daniel wasn't there yet, but he could feel something shifting. The anger wasn't his enemy. The grief wasn't weakness. The shadow wasn't a monster. It was just the part of him that had been screaming for attention while he kept turning up the noise. And now, finally, he was listening. Daniel stopped waiting for the noise to return. For weeks, he'd been bracing himself for the moment when life would demand he snap back into place. Back to emails, back to deadlines, back to the version of himself everyone expected. But that moment never came. Or maybe it came, and he just stopped answering. The silence that once felt like absence now felt like presence. Not the loud, performative kind, the quiet, unshakable kind. Eastern philosophy teaches that true strength doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Like a temple, standing through storms, not because it fights the wind, but because it was built on something solid. Daniel was learning what that felt like from the inside. He started walking. No destination. No fitness tracker counting steps. No podcast filling his ears. Just walking. Through his neighborhood, along the river, past places he'd driven by 1,000 times but never really seen. Wu Wei, effortless action, the art of moving without force, stopped being a concept and started being a practice. One foot in front of the other, breathing, noticing. The mind-body connection he'd severed was slowly stitching itself back together, one quiet moment at a time. Buddhism speaks of mindfulness not as something you achieve, but as something you return to. And Daniel was returning, not to who he was before the collapse, but to something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the noise all along. He picked up a book he'd bought years ago and never read, the Tao Te Ching, not because he was looking for answers, but because he was finally ready to sit with questions. One passage stayed with him. The sage doesn't try to be great. That's what makes him great. It hit differently now. For so long, Daniel had been trying to be successful, trying to be strong, trying to prove he was enough. And the trying itself had become the prison. Detachment doesn't mean not caring. It means releasing the grip on outcomes, on identities, on the need to control how you're perceived. Daniel was learning to let go, not because he was giving up, but because he was finally strong enough to stop holding on so tight. His mornings changed. He stopped reaching for his phone the second he woke up. Instead, he'd sit at the edge of his bed, eyes closed, just breathing. 5 minutes, then 10. Then, however long it took for his mind to settle. Meditation and suffering, he realized, weren't opposites. They were dance partners. The suffering showed him where he was stuck. The meditation gave him the space to unstick himself. Zen philosophy teaches that enlightenment isn't a destination. It's a practice. And Daniel was practicing. Not perfectly, not consistently, but honestly. And that was enough. He started saying no to projects that drained him, to social obligations that felt like performance, to the version of success that required him to abandon himself. At first, it felt selfish, but then he remembered something his sister had said. You can't pour from an empty cup. Non-attachment doesn't mean isolation. It means knowing the difference between connection and codependency, between generosity and self-abandonment. Daniel was learning that boundaries weren't walls. They were the foundation of something real. The silence wasn't making him weaker. It was teaching him what strength actually looked like. Not the loud, aggressive, prove-yourself kind, but the quiet, rooted, unshakable kind. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The understanding didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like dawn. Slow, inevitable, impossible to pinpoint the exact moment darkness became light. Daniel was sitting on his balcony one morning, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up when it hit him. The pain had never been about the world being too loud. It had been about him being too quiet with his truth, too quiet with his needs, too quiet with the parts of himself that didn't fit the script he'd been handed. Self-awareness isn't a revelation you stumble upon. It's a recognition you've been avoiding. And Daniel had been avoiding it for years, thinking that if he just worked harder, achieved more, became better, the hollowness would fill itself. But absence doesn't work that way. It just gets louder the longer you ignore it. He thought about all the times he'd dismissed his exhaustion as weakness. All the times he'd told himself to push through, toughen up, stop being so sensitive. The psychology of pain teaches us that suffering isn't the problem. Our relationship with it is. We're taught to see pain as something to fix, to medicate, to outrun. But pain, Daniel was learning, is just information. It's the body's way of saying something here needs attention. And for years, he'd been ignoring the message, treating the messenger like the enemy. Buddhism speaks of dukkha, the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of clinging to what cannot last. Daniel had been clinging to a version of himself that was never meant to be permanent. And the exhaustion? That was just his soul asking permission to evolve. He started journaling, not the structured, goal-oriented kind, just stream of consciousness truth-telling on blank pages that wouldn't judge him. Some entries were angry, some were sad, some were just observations about how strange it felt to finally slow down. One night, he wrote, I spent so long trying to be impressive that I forgot to be real. And underneath that, maybe that's the whole game. We trade authenticity for approval, and then wonder why approval never feels like enough. Spiritual transformation doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small moments of honesty like this, when you stop performing, even for yourself, and just let the truth land on the page. He remembered a conversation he'd had with his grandfather before he passed. The old man had worked in construction his whole life, built houses, roads, bridges, strong hands, quiet presence. Daniel had asked him once what he was most proud of. He expected to hear about a building, a project, something tangible. But his grandfather just smiled and said, "Learning when to rest." At the time, Daniel thought it was a cop-out answer. Now, sitting with his own collapse, he understood. Taoism teaches that rest isn't the opposite of productivity, it's the foundation of it. You can't build anything lasting on exhausted ground. And Daniel had been exhausted for so long, he'd forgotten what solid ground even felt like. The insight wasn't that he needed to change everything. It was that he needed to stop changing to fit everything. Ego dissolution doesn't mean destroying yourself. It means releasing the false versions you've been performing and making space for what's actually true. Daniel wasn't the guy who never broke. He wasn't the guy who had all the answers. He wasn't even the guy who needed to be those things. He was just a man learning to exist without the armor, without the script, without the constant pressure to prove his worth through output, enlightenment through pain. It sounded poetic, but it wasn't comfortable. It was messy and slow, and required him to sit with discomfort longer than he ever thought possible. But somewhere in that discomfort, something was being born. Not a new identity, just the willingness to stop pretending he had to be anyone other than who he was. Daniel didn't go back to work with a plan. He went back with a different rhythm. Same desk, same projects, same colleagues. But something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't performing anymore. He was participating. The difference was subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching. But he felt it, in the way he spoke up when something didn't sit right, in the way he left work at a reasonable hour without guilt, in the way he stopped measuring his worth by how much he could endure. Integration isn't about becoming a different person. It's about becoming the person you've always been, without the masks. Eastern philosophy calls this living with inner stillness, not the absence of movement, but movement that flows from center instead of chaos. His morning still started quietly, not because he was forcing mindfulness, but because he'd learned what happened when he didn't give himself space to breathe before the world made its demands. 5 minutes of sitting, a walk around the block, coffee without scrolling, small rituals that weren't about optimization or self-improvement, just about remembering he was human before he was productive. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment isn't a peak you reach and stay on. It's a practice you return to, again and again, every time you forget. And Daniel forgot often. Some days he slipped back into old patterns, said yes when he meant no, pushed through exhaustion like it was a virtue. But now he noticed. And noticing was everything. He started having different conversations, not just surface-level updates or professional small talk, but real exchanges. One afternoon, a coworker asked how he was doing, and instead of the automatic, "Good, busy," Daniel paused. Told him honestly that he'd been through something heavy, that he was still figuring things out, that some days were harder than others. The guy nodded, said he'd been there too. And just like that, the space between them shifted. Vulnerability doesn't weaken connection. It creates it. Karma and rebirth, in the Buddhist sense, isn't about past lives. It's about the cycles we repeat until we learn the lesson. Daniel had spent years in the cycle of proving, performing, pretending. Now, he was learning a different cycle, one where honesty mattered more than impression. He started reading differently too. Not self-help books promising transformation in 10 steps, but books that asked better questions. Man's search for meaning, by Viktor Frankl. When Things Fall Apart by Pema, Chödrön. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. These weren't quick fixes, they were mirrors, reflecting back the complexity of being human, the reality that trauma healing doesn't follow a timeline, that suffering and awakening aren't opposites but companions on the same path. He'd underline passages, write notes in the margins, not because he was trying to memorize wisdom, but because he was finally ready to absorb it. Non-attachment, he realized, applied to healing too. He couldn't force himself to be fixed. He could only show up, day after day, and trust the process. The biggest shift came in how he saw strength. For so long, he'd equated strength with endurance. How much he could carry, how long he could last, how well he could hide the weight. But real strength, he was learning, was something quieter. It was the ability to feel without drowning, to be present without pretending, to say "I don't know" without shame. Wu Wei, effortless action, wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing what was true, even when it wasn't impressive. Daniel stopped trying to be the guy who never needed help. He asked for support when he needed it. He admitted when he was overwhelmed. He let people see him, not the polished version, but the real one. And what he found was this: people didn't respect him less. They respected him more, because integrity, true integrity, doesn't come from perfection. It comes from showing up as you are, cracks and all, and trusting that's enough. The world didn't get quieter. Daniel just stopped needing it to. The notifications still came. The deadlines still loomed. The noise still existed, but it no longer had the same grip on him. He'd learned to move through chaos without becoming it. Taoism speaks of the river that flows around rocks instead of fighting them. That's what his life started to feel like. Not a battle, not a race, just movement that honored both the current and the stillness beneath it. The practice wasn't about escaping the world. It was about maintaining the axis in the middle of it, breathing when everything screamed, presence when everything pulled. This was the real work, not the retreat, but the return. He noticed it in small moments. A tense meeting where his old self would have forced a smile and agreed to unrealistic timelines. Now he paused, spoke his truth, suggested an alternative that didn't require burning out. His boss looked surprised, then nodded. Fair point. That was it. No drama, no consequences, just boundaries being honored because they were finally being set. The mind-body connection he'd rebuilt wasn't fragile anymore. It was a compass. When his chest tightened, he listened. When his jaw clenched, he asked himself what he was holding that wasn't his to carry. Shadow work had taught him that his body knew things his mind tried to rationalize away. And now, he trusted it. He started showing up differently in his relationships too. His sister called one night, spiraling about a decision she couldn't make. The old Daniel would have jumped straight into fix-it mode, offering solutions, mapping out plans, doing anything to ease her discomfort. But this time, he just listened. Let her talk without interrupting. When she finally paused, he said, "Sounds like you already know what you need to do. You're just scared to trust it." Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, "Yeah, you're right." Zen philosophy teaches that the greatest gift we can offer isn't answers, it's presence. Daniel was learning to be present without needing to perform, to hold space without needing to fill it. That was a different kind of strength, one that didn't announce itself but changed everything. His weekends changed too. He started saying no to things that felt obligatory and yes to things that felt alive. He'd drive out to the coast, sit by the ocean, and just watch the waves. No agenda, no goal, just being. Impermanence became less of a concept and more of a lived truth. The waves came and went, the tide rose and fell. Nothing lasted forever, and that was okay. He thought about the version of himself who'd collapsed in that office bathroom months ago, the man who thought his life was ending. That man wasn't wrong. Something had ended. But what came after wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to choose differently. Space to feel fully. Space to exist without needing to justify his existence through achievement. One evening, walking home from work, Daniel passed a man on the street corner, disheveled, asking for change. The old Daniel would have walked past, eyes down, uncomfortable. But this time, he stopped, made eye contact, handed him a few dollars, and asked his name. "Marcus," the man said, surprised. They talked for a few minutes. Nothing deep, just human-to-human exchange. As Daniel walked away, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection without transaction. Samsara and nirvana, the cycle of suffering and the release from it, weren't separate realms. They coexisted. The world was still broken. People were still hurting. But Daniel was learning that peace wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up with a clear heart, even when clarity didn't change the chaos. That was the practice. That was the return. Not transcendence, just presence, just breath, just this moment and then the next. Daniel still walks through the same city, same streets, same buildings, same noise, but something inside him moved, and nothing looks the same anymore. The strength that no one sees isn't about what you endure, it's about what you're finally willing to release. The peace you've been searching for wasn't hiding in the silence. It was waiting beneath the noise, in the space you were too afraid to enter. Here's what they don't tell you about transformation. It doesn't make life easier. It makes you realer. You stop performing. You stop pretending the weight doesn't exist. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can carry without breaking. And in that stopping, in that sacred, terrifying pause, you find something the noise could never give you. Yourself. Not the polished version. Not the acceptable version. Just you. Raw. Human. Enough. Eastern philosophy has always known what the modern world keeps forgetting. The teacher isn't in the mountain. It's in the valley. Enlightenment doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from walking straight through it with your eyes open. Shadow work. Self-awareness. Ego dissolution. These aren't buzzwords. They're the map, back to who you were before the world told you who to be. And the journey? It never really ends. It just gets quieter, clearer, more true. So here's the question only you can answer. Are you still pretending the noise is the problem? Or are you finally ready to hear what the silence has been trying to tell you all along? If this video stirred something in you, something you can't quite name but can definitely feel, then stay. Don't scroll past it. Don't distract yourself from it. Sit with it. Let it move through you. Because that discomfort, that's not weakness knocking. That's clarity asking for permission to enter. And if you're ready to go deeper, if you want to understand how discipline can either destroy you or set you free, watch the video I'm recommending next. The discipline that destroys you is the same one that sets you free. It'll show you the difference between control that suffocates and structure that liberates. Daniel's story continues there, and maybe so does yours. Continue walking. The next lesson is waiting.